First of all, I'd really like to thank JCT, Richard, Neil, the JCT board, for inviting me to speak. It is a really important thing from the CLC's point of view that we do have, I guess, the opportunity to reach out to a wider audience, because it is very easy for us, whether we're big fish or small fish, to simply swim in our own pond, if you like, and never really talk to anyone else. And so I hope that part of tonight is simply the CLC reaching out and saying, we are trying to move things forward. These are some of our ideas. What do you think? And that's maybe the main drive of my message. Just to put this into context, and it's not a proper context at all, a couple of weeks ago I had the enormous pleasure of going on a trip with my family to the Grand Canyon. And so myself, my husband and my 18-year-old son stood at the side of the canyon and looked at it in awe, you know, this vast abyss in front of us. And myself and my husband were awestruck. And my 18-year-old said, I'd love to put on a flight suit and jump down it. And I think that really sort of sums up sort of where we are in the construction industry. Are we looking on at this cliff face or this abyss in awe, or in fear, or in trepidation, or whatever, or are we prepared to take that leap forward and you know, not without a parachute, but nonetheless accept that industry is moving forward, things are moving forward, and really we either move or we get left behind. And that is very much part of the CLC's message. So, who is the CLC? Well, this is a rogues gallery, if ever you've seen one. First thing I have to say is I actually had to change these slides after I'd issued them to JCT, because in the period of time between issuing them and speaking today, the Minister, Lord Henley, has been appointed, his predecessor having resigned. I've been on the CLC for 15, 16 months, and I'm on my third minister with responsibilities for construction. And I think that does give a little bit of a message to those in the industry about sort of where the industry stands. Now, that said, Greg Clark, who is responsible for BEIS, so the Minister of State ultimately responsible, he has been in position continuously, and I think he is actually quite supportive of the construction industry. So that is an important sort of bit of background. But as you can see, we come from a number of different companies. We have all sorts of personal and vested interests. We're not represented particularly, we weren't elected, we were appointed. But we're all there, we all donate our time, it's not a paid body, and you know, I guess we are trying to move something forward. So what is it we're actually trying to do at the CLC? Well, this is a graph that was produced by McKinsey. It's based on real research, it's not just a bit of scribble across the board. And the yellow line is productivity in the construction sector. The darker line is productivity in the general UK economy. And McKinsey's thesis is very simple, that although we have made some productivity gains, and what you'll clearly see is we've made some productivity losses, and productivity actually maps the economic cycle incredibly closely, it has to be said. But nonetheless, since sort of 1995, we clearly have made some productivity gains in the construction sector, but we haven't made anything like the level of productivity gains that other sectors in the UK have made. This isn't comparing the UK to other parts of the world, this is just comparing construction to other areas of UK business. And so, sort of, again, McKinsey's thesis, therefore, is very straightforward. If we could simply close that productivity gap, so if we simply, as an industry, could make the same gains as, on average, everybody else has, then we would be £16 billion more productive. Now, that's quite a big number. And you can then immediately see why government are interested in this. And the overarching purpose of the CLC is actually to put recommendations in place that improve productivity in the construction sector. We've got lots and lots of sub-objectives, it's got lots and lots of sort of explanation, but ultimately it is what can the industry do to improve productivity. Add to that, so McKinsey has said there's 16 billion at stake, even if we can simply close that productivity gap. Add to that, my belief, and this is something that I'll talk about more later, is that we're only, in that particular graph, really and truly looking at productivity of, if you like, the construction environment. There's loads of other areas of productivity that we could actually gain in. So things like whole life efficiency, economies of scale, quality and health and safety, all sorts of other things that add to productivity that could actually make the construction industry even more productive. So that 16 billion could become an even bigger figure. Now what this graph, and this is another McKinsey graph, what this graph shows is that there's not actually a single part of the construction cycle where that money is lost, if you like. It's actually a series of incremental gains. In some ways, that makes it an easier problem to solve, but in some ways it makes it a more difficult one, because I do feel that the government are looking for a sort of golden bullet, and actually there isn't one. There's loads and loads of little things that if we add them all together will actually make the industry more productive. Now, why the sort of CLC, I guess, was formed was really on the sort of, its birth fell into place with the government's construction strategy back in 2013. And the construction strategy has a number of objectives that I'm sure you're all familiar with, and so there's some fairly scary numbers there. So the construction strategy actually sets these targets out that government would like the construction industry to achieve. Now, of course, it would like us to achieve them, because that means that either the government has more money, or if you look at it in a sort of a more productive way, that we can build more houses, we can increase rail capacity, we can build more schools, etc. So, is it about saving money or is it about building capacity? Well, it's probably in truth a bit of both. Where this has, I think, coalesced into something that actually might have legs. And I completely take Richard's point that I've only been involved for 15 months, but I've met a lot of people. And all of those people have told me about all the different talking shops and workshops and committees and goodness knows what else they've been involved in all the years. What I'm hoping, and it is a hope, but it isn't a completely blind hope, what I'm hoping is that the current industrial strategy proposal that is being written as we sit here actually will give some focus to some of the work that the CLC is putting forward. I'm quite sure that many of you are conversant with the fact that in January an industrial strategy green paper was released. Now, this isn't just about construction. This is much wider than construction. This is the entire economy. But that industrial strategy consultation has now finished. The white paper is being drafted, and we have it on reasonably good authority that within the next month or so, that white paper will actually be released. And why this is particularly important is that one of the things that, and again, this is probably driven by Greg Clark, one of the things that the government are really, really looking for in that white paper, which is the response to the green paper, is how can we actually build the UK economy in a post-Brexit environment, because we have to face the fact that that's the environment we're going to be in, to ensure that we have a sustainable economy going forward. So looking to build on strengths and extend excellence are the sort of quotes that come through the strategy. Close the gap between the UK's most productive companies and industries, places, people, and the rest. I mean, that's quite an interesting thing to come out of a government strategy paper, if you like, and make the UK one of the most competitive places in the world to start and grow businesses. So some really, really lofty ambitions. But why I think this could be different, and I accept that it might not be, but this could be different, is that they've couched it in terms of what can industry do and what can government do, and what can we do together. So the question, it is quite question-based, at least the consultation paper. The question is, how can we improve this thing together, rather than simply, I think in the past, the government have always gone, well, construction's rubbish, why don't you improve? And then sort of move on to the next thing. So I feel there is a little bit more of a sort of backdrop of working together at the moment. So the CLC, and again, some of you will know Andrew Wolstenholme, who's the real chair of the CLC, if you like. He's also the chief exec of Crossrail, so again, he's doing it in his spare time. But Andrew Wolstenholme has got a very clear vision indeed, and Andrew's vision appears to work in threes. And for really good reason, because Andrew's point is that when you're trying to brief a minister who has got in his portfolio probably 15 different things, so construction only forms a really small part of this. When you're trying to brief a minister, don't go in with a 46-page document, because he or she is never going to read it, and they probably won't understand it even if they did. So Andrew's, and that's not sort of in any way denigrating the ministers, it's just recognising the fact that they have enormously large portfolios, and that's the way it is. So Andrew's saying, okay, what are the three fundamental things that are going to affect the construction industry over the next 10, 15, 20 years? And he and we at the CLC have boiled that down to these three really big things. That digital is already here, but I don't think that we've really and truly harnessed its real impact in terms of the construction sector. Manufacturing, again, there's been a lot of talk about off-site manufacturing for a long time. We're not just talking about off-site manufacturing, we're also talking about robotics, on-site manufacturing as well. That's going to make a massive impact in the next 10, 15 years in terms of the construction sector. And finally, and this is probably the one in truth closest to my heart, finally moving away from simply looking at the asset to looking at the asset's performance. Does it do what it was actually originally intended to do, and does it do it for very long? And I think those three things together do give a really good basis for then sort of taking some recommendations forward. So, in order to actually do anything, because it's all very well having lofty ideas, but when I joined the CLC, Andrew Wolstenholme did say, but you need to be able to implement them. So what we've come up with is what we call the enablers. So in order to deliver improvements in digital, or improvements that come from digital, improvements that come from manufacturing, and improvements that come from changes in performance, or the way that we sort of look at performance, we've come up with these three enablers. And the enablers are about procurement, which is really what I'm going to talk about, but also innovation and industry-led innovation and skills. And so we've got that sort of, you know, the three targets and the three enablers coming together to form a strategy. And the view, quite simply, is that if we get this right, then we will actually potentially deliver a lot. For, you know, industry, we will deliver improved profitability, we will have higher levels of skills, we'll have more sustainable business models, and we should increase exports. Now, again, Andrew doesn't deal in halves, it's fair to say, but then I guess that if you're the chief exec of Crossrail, you can't, because you sort of have to really look at the big picture. So these are the objectives that have been set, and we've started to get a bit of a sort of delivery mechanism to go behind them. Why I think this also stands a really, at least a reasonable chance of some success, and you know, we all have to be careful in couching our words, is that there's other things happening out in the wider environment that suggest that change is also on the horizon. And a lot of these things are now day-to-day things. So clearly, technology I've already spoken about. Digital is a main part of our structure. The workforce is effectively in crisis. I mean, we all know that the average age of the construction industry is getting older every year. We know that there's a challenge in productivity. That's, you know, well documented. But possibly the bigger thing, and the others are big, but I think this is the biggest, is that disruptors are on the horizon. I mean, they're not sort of like a long way now. They're sort of coming over the hill. And what I mean by disruptors is people that don't have any of our baggage whatsoever. They weren't trained like us, they haven't worked in the industry like us, they actually probably don't even think like us, if I'm absolutely honest. And you know, some of the stats up there, so the first stat, and I think these are really, you know, really interesting, is that Chinese contractors now make up 20% of the major contractors in the world. And if you go back only, 20 odd years, not even 20 years, 12 years, they only made up 3%. Now that figure alone should be something that makes us all wake up and think actually change is on the horizon. The other figures though, the other graphics, you know, we've all seen the impact of people like electric cars with Tesla. We've all seen how Airbnb or, you know, Uber have completely changed the way that we actually make transactions. Now maybe not all of us do, but society does. And so that change is clearly on the horizon for construction. Now, there's a really interesting question, and this is one of the questions that I sort of have some answers. I mean, I don't have answers for the audience particularly to this question, but I sort of have some answers, I guess, is who's going to benefit from the change? And if the CLC or the government or anybody else make recommendations, then who benefits from the recommendations? And I think that that is a really, really important question. Because if we can't get to a point where the worst case is neutrality and the best case is that everybody gets some sort of benefit, then there are so many different parties out there. I mean, there are, I think there's 280,000 different companies registered in the construction sector. If we can't get some level of alignment in what the objectives are, and therefore whether or not we're actually going to focus on those objectives and deliver those objectives, then it's very, very unlikely indeed that we're actually going to be able to implement them. And so that who benefits from the sort of recommendations is an important thing. And so although the CLC was undoubtedly set up to deliver this 14 or 15 billion pounds worth of savings to government, I think that unless we consider that wider agenda of how does the industry benefit as well, it hasn't got a hope in hell of actually achieving anything, because people will go, well, what's in it for me? There's nothing, and simply won't do it. And I think that that is something that I've tried to bring quite sort of strongly through the piece of work that I've been doing. Now, again, I don't know if any of you are film buffs, but this is a shot from a film called The Big Short, and The Big Short is the story of the guys that predicted the financial crash. And of course there were people, and they didn't just predict it because they felt it in their bones. I mean, they predicted it because they analysed the available data and said, actually, this cannot go on forever. This is simply an unsustainable market, and at some point it's going to crash. And one of the guys that did the work on this was a very clever chap who's just won the Nobel Prize for Economics called Richard Thaler. And Richard Thaler, again, don't get me wrong, I'm not an expert on this, but Richard Thaler's sort of view is actually can become quite simplistic in some ways. Because what he said is that it's all about decision making, and human beings are fundamentally flawed when it comes to decision making. And there's a thing called overconfidence or confidence optimization. And basically, even though all the evidence that's presented to us demonstrates that it is very unlikely that your project will come in on budget, for example, clients still have that sort of fundamental belief somewhere in the back of their mind that their project will, even though the evidence supports the opposite view. And the problem with this, and what Thaler's work shows, is that this is really hardwired. And evidence isn't enough. It's simply presenting a client with evidence to the contrary is unlikely to change a hard-held opinion, as we see in lots and lots of different examples. And so where I've sort of come from, therefore, in terms of what I'm trying to do at the CLC is say, well, what are the structural changes we can make? What are the things that we can put in place that actually nudge people to actually change their behaviours, rather than simply go, well, the evidence says this, so that's what you've got to do, goodbye, and walk away. Because the fact of the matter is that there is piles and piles of this stuff out there. I mean, if you want guidance on anything, I can guarantee you that it already exists, and I couldn't do any better job and probably do a worse job than most people have already written it. And that's not really what I'm about particularly. It's more trying to get some commonality of behaviours and views that actually take us forward. So what is it I'm actually trying to do? Well, as I said, we've got the three enablers, the procurement, the innovation, and the skills. My bit's procurement. I mean, I'm quite interested in the other two, but to be honest, my bit's big enough for me to cope with, so I'm sort of leaving that to people better placed to do that. And so, again, using the theme of everything has to be in threes, and this was quite difficult, actually, sort of trying to boil this down to three. What I've said, my sort of, really my major point, if you remember nothing else of today, this is my major point, is that we simply need to change the way that clients and indeed advisors, and given that there's probably quite a few advisors in the room, how they interpret value. Indeed, how they define value, not even how they interpret it, because actually the definition comes first, I guess. And so my sort of proposition is that we need to be procuring for what I've called better value. Now, we could argue for hours what better value means, and I'll give you a few ideas of what I mean by that. But really, if we can't start procuring for value rather than simply for cost, then the CLC will achieve nothing, in my view, and that's probably quite a strong sort of admonishment to make of them, but that's really my opening piece. And so in order to do that, how do we actually procure for better value? Well, again, my threes are, we need to look at outcomes, first of all. We need to get away from sort of inputs, if you like, and go to what is the asset or being built for, or whether it's an asset. What is this piece of work being done for ultimately? Not what is it being done for in the first place, if you like. We have to increase, in my view, transparency of the industry. We have to root out poor performance. We have to share data. We have to make, really, the industry move into the 21st century, because a lot of the things that we currently do are based in sort of 19th century points of view. And so really and truly, we have to improve industry transparency in order to, again, move the industry forward. But what we also have to do, we do have to get some of the basics right, and there are some really, really bad things out there at the moment that actually would be relatively easy to improve. They're all a bit boring and tedious, and I think lots of people probably don't really want to spend the time doing it, but actually, those sort of hygiene factors, if you like, if we don't improve those, then some of the other improvements won't be as effective. So for me, there's those three prongs. It's outcome-based procurement, it's improved transparency, and it's also getting some of the basics of sort of tendering and process right as well. So, again, it's all very well me saying all this stuff, but actually who's going to do any of it? What chance of success have I got? Now, these figures, and I was one of the trade bodies that gave me these figures, but I'm sure these figures are right. Even in central procurement, if you like, so publicly funded or regulated clients, there are over 400 major budget holders. I'm not talking about somebody who occasionally does a little bit of refurbishment. I'm talking about people who actually procure reasonably large assets or large buildings of some sort on a fairly regular basis. Now that figure alone sort of makes you want to wilt in a way, because it's sort of like, for goodness sake, I mean, I thought I'd just got to coordinate 280,000 businesses, but I now find that I've got 400 sort of centrally held budget holders, all of whom have a level of autonomy. And in fact, some of the civil servants have explained to me that one of the principles of democracy is that budget holders are semi-autonomous, because then you can't sort of get some dictator in the middle telling everybody what to do. Now that was oh, okay, I sort of understand that, but actually if you want efficiency and effectiveness and change, then perhaps sometimes you do have to pull some of these things together. So, we do sort of recognise that some of the things that the CLC are going to put forward will actually be quite challenging to implement from a government perspective, even though the government have asked us to actually look at this. So that's just, sort of gives a little bit of background context. Now, that said, all is not lost from a government perspective. Quite recently, back in October last year now, so just over a year ago, the Crown Commercial Services, so CCS, who are ultimately responsible for an enormous amount of government construction, introduced a thing called the Balanced Scorecard, which some of you are probably familiar with. Some of you have probably come across it but didn't know that was what it was called. And the Balanced Scorecard is a great thing if it was properly implemented. So the Balanced Scorecard basically says that if you want to procure something that the government or any actual publicly funded entity are going to buy, then you can't just consider cost. You're not allowed to just consider cost. You actually have to consider loads of other things. And that's a screenshot from their website. Unfortunately, you can't really read it. But it's things like whole life. It's actually things like the impact on the local economy. I mean, some of these things are quite ephemeral. They're not even sort of related to your project. The problem with this, in my view, and this is a personal view, is that it is open to too wide interpretation and it's too little known about. So it's quite easy to basically make all the qualitative parts of it yes/no answers, and then you still go back to lowest price anyway, because everybody gets a yes on all the qualitative questions, because that's why you've gone to those sort of organisations in the first place, and very quickly you've ticked all your boxes and you've gone back to lowest cost. So what I would say, though, and the reason I put this up, is that at least I feel that there is some sort of momentum within government to actually acknowledge that simply going for lowest cost does not give you best value. I feel that the CLC can therefore build on this and actually start putting things in place, which means that maybe we'll get something a bit better. Now, there are some great case studies coming out at the moment in some of the regulated industries. This is taken from Anglian Water. And Anglian Water, I think, I don't know if anyone from Anglian Water's here, but I think Anglian Water are a truly brilliant example of people sort of almost turning the industry upside down and saying, okay, we've got a huge asset base, we've got an enormous customer base. I mean, obviously everybody ultimately has to have water and has to have their sewage taken away. We have some enormous problems, delivery problems. It's costing us too much money. We're leaking water all over the place. So let's completely turn this on its head. And instead of looking at cost comes into it eventually, but instead of looking at base level cost, let's actually look at the objectives we're trying to deliver. And the Ofwat, the water regulator, have worked really closely with the water authorities to actually redefine the way that they actually set project objectives. And so the sort of things now that you would find in an Anglian Water sort of project delivery programme are things like satisfied customers. And this isn't sort of Anglian Water don't see themselves as the customer. The customer is you or I, whoever's drinking the water. Things like fair charges, so suddenly cost does come into it because clearly, but does the customer think it's fair? Not do Anglian think it's fair? Obviously, they've got to produce safe and clean water. I mean, some of these are obvious and some of them are less obvious. But what this has done, actually quite quickly, has then led Anglian to go, so how do we change? These are our objectives, we know this. And what they've done, and I'm not saying that this would work in every case, it's simply a case study that I've sort of put forward, is they've said, well, actually, we were looking at it all wrong because we were looking at annual or probably budgets over 4 or 5 year cycles. And they've gone completely over to what they're calling TOTEX. So TOTEX is total cost. So it's a combination of capital cost and operational cost. And they now appraise all their business plans on a TOTEX basis, not on a CapEx basis. And that single change alone has actually really fundamentally changed the way that they procure services, the way they procure contractors, the way that they actually design things, quite honestly. So we have, and it's, again, one of the things that sort of moves me forward, if you like. So although I think that parts of the industry are perhaps lagging back in the 19th century, actually parts of the industry have leapt forward into the 21st century quite quickly. And so, you know, there is hope, if you like. So that brings me to the first recommendation that I am making. Now, you might ask, so to whom am I making these recommendations? Am I making them to you? Am I making them to other audiences that I speak to? No, I'm actually making these recommendations via the CLC to government, effectively. And I mean, the proof of the pudding will be in the eating in terms of what comes out in the industrial strategy. Will construction even get a look in? And if we get a look in, will we get more than a sentence? But, you know, that's probably a month hence at the moment, or certainly 3 weeks hence. But these are recommendations that have at least gone to somebody, and somebody who might be able to do something about it. So my first recommendation, and this is very much 3 legs of a 3-legged stool. None of these recommendations really work in isolation. My first one is quite simple, which is that if we want to capture maximum benefit that projects or programs can achieve, the definition of value must be expanded to include elements, other elements. And I mean, this is by no means a definitive list. These are the elements that I think are important. Again, I think it's horses for courses. But what I would say is that whole life value always has to be one of them. Whatever else is on the list, if you're not including whole life value, I can't really see how you have redefined value. I think that you should be looking at carbon. I think you should be looking at digital effectiveness. I think you should be looking at social value. Again, working on Andrew's 3s, I'm not sure that I'm going to get the whole list through, but I hope to get 2 or 3 of them. And certainly, as I said, my number one undoubtedly is the whole life value. I know that Andrew's number 2 is the level of off-site manufacture or pre-manufactured value that's actually going into construction projects. And he believes quite strongly that that should actually have an additional weighting in the tender process because of the sort of change that will actually make to the construction industry. That's quite an interesting thing. So my first recommendation is really simple, that we simply need to redefine value. So you think, oh, well, that's easy enough then. How do we do that? And what I said, I've spent quite a lot of time, and apologies to members of other professional bodies and organisations. This is just a snapshot of one of the ones that I'm a member of, as I've morphed from one to another. But what I've done is I've canvassed the views of many of the professional institutions and the Construction Industry Council, which is the sort of overarching body for the professional institutions. And there is a fair head of steam, actually, amongst the institutions for developing a cross-industry common procurement code, if you like. I initially called it a standard, but I was told, don't call it a standard because everybody will think it belongs to the British Standards Institute. So I don't know what I'll call it. Civil servants, again, were coming up with some language for it. But effectively, it's a code of practice, a body of knowledge, whatever it is, that all the advisors are trained in, all the institutions agree that this is a good way to take procurement forward. Government clients actually are educated in and have a level of buy-in to it. And I don't think that this is a ridiculous dream. I actually think that this is achievable. I think that we could put in place a new way of procuring things that could get that level of buy-in and that level of support, and it won't be used universally. Nothing's used universally. But I think that the moment is probably right where there would be a level of support across both government, and bearing in mind the industrial strategy says, what will industry do and what will government do, where we could maybe get both coming to the same point to actually put in place a new way of procuring things. But it's got to have substance. It can't just be Anne going, oh yeah, well, we need to do it like this now. It's got to have proper substance in terms of the way it's drafted, the way people are educated in it. And in fact, I actually think that the education side of it is possibly even more important than the drafting side of it. one of the things that and again, being a member of sort of two professional institutions, I can say this. Well, I could say it anyway. One of the things that I think is a real problem in our industry, if I'm absolutely honest, is that I think we all get really set in our ways. This is professional advisors. I'm not talking about clients now, I'm talking about professional advisors. And I think that, you know, we do become siloed, but we don't just become siloed in our professions, we become siloed in our experiences as well. And so then what happens is, to a very great extent, if I use the, and apologies because I realise it's moved on, but, you know, when I qualified, it was JCT 81. So that's my favourite contract. Just because that's the one I trained in, that's the one I sort of vaguely know the order of the clauses, and that's the one that if anybody asked me to think of a contract, I could think of it first. And the problem with a lot of us, and I hold my hand up on this, is that we aren't actually moving forward as quickly as some parts of the industry are. And yet we all also complain that the industry isn't moving forward fast enough. So I think the second part of this particular recommendation, and this is why I felt particularly strongly that the professional institutions had to be involved, was it's not just about drafting this new standard, whatever this standard is, it's also about implementing it through the universities, through the professional institutions, through all the different training bodies, and through client training as well. So that was sort of my proposal. So on the other side of it then, if I'm successful, if we're successful, because there's no way I could do this on my own, then what can government do? Well, it's really simple what government could do. They could just mandate that it's used. Just as they did with BIM. Now, I know that BIM level 2, and we can all moan about it, and we can all say, yeah, but I know loads of public sector clients that aren't doing it, and we've all got our own pet problems with it. But actually, the UK is as far developed in BIM as any nation on earth at the moment, and far more developed than many, it has to be said. And part of that is because government mandated it. The only other country that's probably at the same sort of level of us is Singapore. Guess what? Their government mandated it as well. So actually, a degree of enforcement, and that takes me back to who are the budget holders, I think is really important, because if you've got 400 substantial bodies who can all pretty much choose how they want to procure things, somebody somewhere at government level has got to go, actually you have to do it this way, or at least you have to explain why you're not, maybe. I can see that you wouldn't always do it. So that's my sort of, my fundamental change that I want to make to the industry. So, what's the next thing then that I actually think we should be doing? So my next stage then is this thing that I've called increased transparency and performance across the industry. Now, this one sort of ought to be easy. And the reason I say it sort of ought to be easy, and goodness knows I don't know how to do it, is that most other industries are already doing this. So what I mean by transparency is things like, are end users satisfied? Did the contractor do what they said they were going to do? Did the consultant do what they said they were going to do? Does the building or the bridge or whatever it is you've built actually function properly in the way that you anticipated it would? And of course, you know, we've got lots and lots of examples of where this works. So TripAdvisor happens to be one that, you know, actually not only do we have a great example of how people rate things, TripAdvisor make loads of money off it as well. So I think at the very least somebody ought to be putting this into the construction sector, because it could be a really profitable thing for them to do. But I'm not suggesting that we quite have a construction industry TripAdvisor, but what I'm saying is that lots of other industries actually feel very closely obligated to their customers. And by customers, I mean end users now. I think the construction industry is too far removed from its end users, and therefore doesn't actually have a great feel of what the end users feel like. And I think that that would be a relatively simple bridge to connect, if you like. So really what I'm saying in terms of my second recommendation is quite a simple thing. It's that if we want to build on best practice, and again, I don't want everybody to think that I'm a real naysayer here, because actually there's huge amounts of brilliant best practice out there. It's just that not everybody's doing it. So if we want to build on best practice and eradicate worst practice, then public comparisons have to be available. And I don't think they really are available at the moment. I think you have to search really hard for them, and even then, they're a bit dubious, because people will always publish the good stuff, but they won't publish the bad stuff. And so you never really get those proper public comparisons. You know, even at real base level, does my house perform as well as your house? No idea, absolutely no idea. I just know what my bill is, but don't know what yours is. And that sort of level, again, with the digital age, this ought to be so simple. So why isn't it happening? Well, the reasons that it's not happening are the same sort of reasons as the first one's not happening. We've got no consistent standards of how asset performance can be measured. Sorry, not can be measured, should be measured. We've got loads of standards of how it could be measured. There's no requirement on most contracts for anybody to capture any data, particularly not post-occupation performance data. You might have to capture a bit of construction data. No national rating system for suppliers anyway, so even if you're capturing the data, what do you do with it? And there's no consistent standards for measuring end-user satisfaction at all. In fact, I've had difficulty finding any standards to measure end-user satisfaction, other than some of the private sector customers who sort of measure it in a way. So somebody like Tesco do measure it because they know exactly how many people shop in their shops and can correlate that to how much they spent on them. But even that isn't necessarily a direct correlation. So, you know, therefore, what do we have to do about it? Well, actually, this should be really easy, because we need to develop some consistent standards. This is what the industry could do. We need to create some sort of rating system. And in fact, there are a number of government departments that are looking at this. So the Department of Transport are looking at it at the moment. McKinsey's are doing a piece of work on industry benchmarking as well. So there is sort of work out there. And then what does government need to do? Well, government simply needs to actually make sure that this data is captured, and captured in a place that the rest of us can access it. So I'm actually, I think that particular recommendation probably is more in government's hands than industry's hands, but I think we all have to work together. But that one is more about, is there a will? And of course, the benefits to government are massive, because if they have this sort of benchmark data, if they can compare one contractor to another, if they can compare one consultant to another, then surely they're in a better position as a client to actually start moving the industry forward. Private sector. I think private sector clients do tend to capture this data for themselves, but they don't publish it to their competitors, inevitably. So that I've probably breached a copyright there. That happens to be from Mitchells and Butlers, who benchmark. Very interestingly, they benchmark every single thing that they build or spend money on. They benchmark it against all the previous ones that they've done. And if it falls outside a certain parameter, it won't get financial approval. And it's like, well, we won't make any money on it, so don't even bother doing it. Really quite an interesting process. So obviously it's happening it's probably happening in the public sector as well, but it's not happening on an open data basis. And again, one of the things that I really think that we all need to wake up to in the construction sector is that data is virtually free now. That's a fact, whether we like it or not. And that freedom of data storage means that effectively we are going to get freedom of information, because somebody will, I mean, you know, we've seen the Paradise Papers this week. Even if you try and keep it secret, somebody will eventually release it. I think we need to go completely the other way, grasp the nettle and say, actually, we're just going to go to an open access system, and actually we'll make all this data available to everyone. And as consultants, as advisors, as professionals, we then need to interpret the data for customers rather than sort of pretend that our skill base is simply collecting data, because it's not anyway. So again, a bit of a personal view. So that brings me on to my sort of third part of my three-legged stool. We have to improve procurement efficiency. If we can't improve procurement efficiency and get the basics right, then a lot of the sort of good things that I've talked about won't really work anyway, because people will still carry on looking at the fact that it's a really inefficient business. And I think some of these things are what I call the real Cinderellas of the industry. You know, people have been talking about them for a very long time, but I'm not sure that that much has been done about them. And where I think that this becomes we again could potentially have a solution is the industry is made up, not made up, that's not the fair thing. The industry is represented by many, many different bodies. And each one of those bodies has been formed for a really good reason. I mean, people didn't just set them up and then sort of, for their own sort of self-gratification. They were all set up to achieve certain objectives. But what has happened, or in my view has happened over the years, that those representative bodies have actually become relatively isolated from each other. Now, to be fair, we have seen some amalgamation and some bringing together, but we still have quite a broad base. I think last time I counted, there were 32 significant representative bodies in the construction sector. And I'm now talking about actually representing operatives or contractors or whatever. I'm not even talking about professional institutions where there's another 50 or something. But I think we have the opportunity, again, that the industrial strategy gives us, to bring those bodies together and say, okay, what are the really, really important things? You know, we know there's loads of stuff, but what are the really important things that you would like to see change on? And so my third recommendation, and again, this does require the support of BEIS, the government department, is that BEIS should actually be really proactive and bring those bodies together. With the CLC, if you need sort of some level of independence or whatever we could bring to it, and agree a common approach on fair payment, retentions, and standardised pre-qualification. And I don't think that that is rocket science. I actually think that that could be done. Now, it will involve people working together that have been adversaries in the past. It will involve a degree of compromise on probably both the part of BEIS and some of the representative bodies, and it will involve quite a lot of hard work. But again, the advantages that this will bring to the entire industry are enormous. I mean, just, you know, the numbers are quite staggering. The amount of money that contractors or subcontractors waste on repetitive tendering and pre-qualification, answering exactly the same questions in this questionnaire that they answered in that questionnaire. The amount of money that is tied up in money owed to level 2 and 3 contractors because they've not been paid appropriately for the work that they've done runs into hundreds and hundreds of millions of pounds. The amount of money that's tied up in retentions again, runs into hundreds of millions of pounds. And these are all problems that simply could be solved. Now, again, I think that we are seeing some progress on this because we have only in the last couple of weeks, BEIS have issued their consultation document on both payment and retentions. I mean, just as an aside, that was written in March. So I saw the first draft of it 6 months ago, but nonetheless, it has gone out. But again, the pressure that I'm trying to exert through the CLC is that they have to be more proactive than simply sending out a consultation paper. There has to be an actual bringing together and a meeting of minds on these things, because if we can solve these issues, then a lot of these hygiene factors that have bogged the industry down for so long, we just don't have to talk about them anymore, and we can move on to the more interesting and more exciting things. I say I couldn't stand here today, could I, without mentioning contracts. And one of my recommendations to government, and I, working for a quantity surveying practice, I believe this one really heartily, is can we just stop amending contracts? I don't really mind which one I mean, clearly I should say we should always use JCT contracts because that's our host. Actually, as an advisor, I don't really mind which one you use, but can you just use it and not amend it? And I think, again, that is my message to government. And if you are going to amend it, can you just amend it all the same? So at least we can learn what the amendments are. But why do different government departments have different amendments in the same contract is utterly beyond me. So that's my sort of plea, really, I guess, for the government on that one. Now, those of you who know me, and some of them in the audience do know me, I am, if nothing, an eternal optimist. And I actually think that when we look back over the last 100 years, and I hasten to add I can't actually look back 100 years, but anyway, actually the construction industry has come an enormously long way. So the picture on the right is a picture allegedly taken in 1917, and you can see, you know, it was pretty basic construction in 1917. The one on the top left is, some of you I'm sure will recognise, is from Alveda's own Pet, which was a really popular TV series that probably did more to destroy the image of the construction industry than any other single act. That was released in 1982, the year I graduated, and that was sort of the view, if you like, of construction. The bottom left-hand one is a picture taken from Crossrail this year. And actually, I think that looks like a considerable improvement, even since 1982, let alone since 1917. The bottom right is a PR picture from well, basically a digger manufacturer who believes that within 10 years, that's what you're going to be seeing on site. So, you know, where are we going next? But I think, you know, all I'm trying to capture there is say we're probably not quite as bad as we think we are. And actually, we've made a lot of progress in the last 100 years. Unfortunately, the progress needs to speed up. And I think now, you know, we really need to decide, can we rewire the industry? Can we rewire our brains for change? And are we, like my son, prepared to put on the flight suits and jump into the canyon? Or are we going to stand on the side and go, oh, it all looks a bit scary down there? And I think really that's the question for both the industry and for government, actually. So on that note, that sort of brings me to the end. The COC are putting forward a deal which we hope will form part in some shape or form of the industrial strategy. That is our target. If it works both for government and for the industry. It makes us more profit, it makes us more efficient, it makes us more effective. And really, I guess that's the message I wanted to deliver to you. So thank you for your time.